So we want to thank everyone for coming. I'm Max. I'm Max McGill. I'm the consultant for the Legislative Jewish Caucus in the Senate. Unfortunately, our assembly rep was called down to LA at the last minute, but we're really delighted everyone was able to join us. This came together initially after the tragic shooting in Buffalo. Salam with MPAC approached us and was saying, hey, how can we work together to educate more folks about the Great Replacement Theory, make sure that this is something that we all have a strong understanding about across communities and how it is really an issue that affects everyone. So this is going to be moderated today by David Bocarsly, who is the executive director of JPAC, which is a represents 30 major Jewish organizations within California. And Salam, I'm sorry,
Al-Marayati.
Marayati.
Just think of Maserati.
Marayati. Who is the president of MPAC, a national Muslim advocacy organization. And we're delighted to have everyone here with us today.
Thank you, Max. Thank you. And thank you for the Jewish Caucus and hosting us. Appreciate the opportunity to engage in conversations. As it was stated, there have been several incidents in the United States, violent attacks against houses of worship, against communities, against the supermarket in Buffalo, that were driven by rhetoric, some of which was based on this thing called the Great Replacement Theory, which actually started in France, and David Myers will talk a little bit about its origin. But for our purpose, the origin is actually the idea that Muslims in France were going to take over the white population. And that theory, that conspiracy theory, it's not really a theory, it's just rhetoric. But in any case, it has now spilled over into American discourse, American mainstream discourse, American mainstream media. And the incidents in Pittsburgh, which is being commemorated this week, an anti-hate summit in Pittsburgh, the attack against the Jewish center there, the incident in Buffalo, Charleston, El Paso, and several others, New Zealand, invoked the Great Replacement. And New Zealand was the attack against the mosque that killed 55 people. So with that is laden this idea of anti-Semitic rhetoric, that Jews will replace us, quote unquote. So we see that it started with Muslims, now it's attacking Jews and people of color. And so it's an attack against all of us. And therefore we have to build a coalition around this issue. And we also see that anti-Muslim animus and anti-Semitism are joined at the hip. These are two issues that its origin is the same origin, the rhetoric is the same kind of rhetoric. And in general, we want to see America like the Spain of the Golden Age and not allow America to become the Spain of the Inquisition. And for that reason, we need to have a conversation. And we brought two experts on this issue, and we look forward to working together on this issue with David Bocarsly of the Jewish Public Affairs Committee and other Jewish partners and other coalition partners. And so with that, I want to thank David for bringing us together and let him say a few words.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us both in person and via Zoom. And thank you, Salam, for partnering on this. I want to echo everything you just said, the importance of us working together to combat hatred that targets both of our communities is more important now than maybe it has ever been. It is a privilege to be able to work with you every day, and particularly to be able to share some of our community experts with our respective communities. So I am the executive director of JPAC, the Jewish Public Affairs Committee. We are a coalition of major Jewish organizations from across the state, lobbying the state government. And we think a lot about how we can combat hatred and bigotry, targeting Jews and non-Jews alike. And what's so important is to remember that a lot of this bigotry and hatred targets Jews and non-Jews in the same way, as you just said, and together. And by way of example, I know we've already mentioned some gruesome mass shootings that have happened in America recently. But I want to say explicitly that versions of the Great Replacement theory were present in the manifestos of the shooters in Pittsburgh and Poway, where Jews were specifically targeted. And in Charleston and in El Paso and in Buffalo, where other communities of color were targeted, with the idea specifically that Jews were the conspiratorial mastermind of this theory. And so you can see the same theory being applied to target our community and your community and so many other communities together. And that's why it's important to understand it and learn about it and figure out how we can move forward together, because together we will be able to effectively try to root out hatred. So thank you to our panelists for being here. I think it's time we maybe make some introductions and get into it.
Let me introduce my friend, close friend, colleague, and really a distinguished person. In fact, that's his title. He's the Distinguished Professor and Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA, David Myers. He's the founding director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. He previously served as the president and CEO of the Center for Jewish History in New York and as the chair of UCLA's History Department. He's the author and editor of 15 books in the field of Jewish history, including The Eternal Dissident, Rabbi Leonard I. Bierman, and The Radical Imperative to Think and Act. And he also has this forthcoming book, American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryas Joel, a Hasidic village in upstate New York, with Nomi Stoltenberg. So with that, David Myers, who will deconstruct for us this idea of the Great Replacement theory, what its roots are, how it involves Jews, Muslims, Blacks, and immigrants, and why it has emerged today.
Right. If you want, I'll quickly introduce Kaleemah so that we can get them both
Yes.
out there, and then we'll go into our history from David. So I get the privilege of introducing Kaleemah Muttaqi. She is a graduate of UC Davis with a degree in international relations. She is a community organizer at Sacramento ACT, which is a multiracial, multi-faith organization that advocates for transformation of our communities rooted in shared faith values. Sacramento ACT works to equip ordinary people to effectively identify and change conditions to create justice and equity. So thank you for being with us. So we'll pass over to Salam. David will start with a little bit of the theory, but we do want this to be a conversation. So feel free, as we're talking, for either of the panelists to be able to jump in as necessary.
Go ahead, David. I think I stated the questions and pretty clear.
So the first thing to say about Great Replacement theory is it's a conspiracy theory. It's a theory that makes sweeping claims about various actors deemed marginal or superfluous in what is essentially a white nationalist political entity. And what I would say at the outset is so particularly dangerous about a Great Replacement theory is that, as Salam suggested, it has migrated from the extreme fringe of the white nationalist movement into the media and political mainstream. Figures like Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham routinely make reference to Great Replacement theory in their own political commentary. And they have in mind, when they invoke it, principally immigrants, whom they believe represent a masked wave who will sweep over white Christian America and replace the true American stock. But it's important to notice, Salam and David recalled, that the chant that we heard in Charlottesville in 2017 was "Jews will not replace us." One of the most manifest expressions of replacement theory that we have seen in recent history. As we also heard, replacement theory has been a common thread that links, I think, minimally, Christchurch, El Paso, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Poway. And in the Great Replacement ecosystem, different groups play different roles. Right? Not everybody plays the role of the actual physical replacers. The physical replacers are, in the American context, immigrants and in associated fashion, people of color. As Salam suggested, or David suggested, the master manipulators who are intent on deploying immigrants to sweep over and displace white Americans are Jews, playing into a long-standing motif in political conspiracy theorizing of the 20th century. That is to say, the Jews are intent on global domination and will use all means available to achieve domination. In great replacement theory, Jews are often the deployers of the unwashed immigrant masses who will replace the true French or American stock. And I mentioned French because the actual idea of the great replacement theory emerged out of France about a decade ago in 2011, when a rather curious libertine French intellectual by the name of Renaud Camus published this book called, in French, The Great Replacement. And I had some familiarity with his ideas before, but I spent some of this weekend reading the book to get a better sense of it. And it's a very simple idea, and it will come as no surprise to you. The idea is non-French read Muslim citizens of France who are cast as immigrants are seeking to replace French white people and overturn the French way of life. Since Camus writes, they cannot assimilate into French society. They have no alternative but to conquer, to subordinate, to replace. So this is a central motif, transforming in a paradoxical but not surprising move the weakest elements, the most socioeconomically disadvantaged elements, the most marginalized elements of French society into a dominant group of persecutors, a very common inversion in various forms of conspiracy theory. What is unsettling is that Camus draws on past traditions in French political culture, and I'll read just one passage upon which he draws. It's all well and good that there are, and I'm translating, so yellow French, black French, brown French. They show that France is open to all races, but on one condition, that they remain a small minority. Otherwise, France will not be France. Right? So there is this kind of pathological fear of being overrun by a immigrant population, a minority population that grows at a rapid rate and that threatens to undo the very idea of French civilization. That's a term invoked again and again in Camus. Now, what is important to note? This is, in some sense, the latest iteration of a conspiracy theory that extends much further back in time. Okay. This idea was not born in 2011 with Renaud Camus. It is a stock component of conspiracy theorizing already in the late 19th century. To offer just two examples. In 1879, a guy named Wilhelm Marr in Germany came up with a term not invoked previously called anti-Semitism. He set out to create a league of anti-Semites to forestall the attempt by the Jews of Germany, who represented a minuscule part of the population, to achieve decisive victory over Germany. The title of the book that laid out this vision was The Victory of Jewishness over Germanness, representing a kind of delusional fantasy of Jews, a small beleaguered minority, being on the verge of taking over Germany. A few years later in France, this idea migrated across that fraught border between Germany and France. And a French intellectual by the name of Edouard Drumont published a book called La France Juive, Jewish France, in which he argued that almost all of the capital of France is owned by Jews, and that Jews are again intent on global domination. Now, I mention this and on subverting the French way of life. I mention this because these two texts are really prefatory to what is sort of the greatest piece of anti-Semitic propaganda ever produced. Greatest, not in terms of its quality, but in terms of its quantity, its dissemination in millions and tens of millions of versions, and that is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion from the early 20th century, from the first half decade of the 20th century. Protocols of the Elders of Zion lay out a vision. It alleges to be a transcript, a protocol of a meeting of Jewish business people from around the world who are intent on achieving world domination and in submitting, causing the submission of Western civilization to Jewish control. It already, a careful reading of the text already reveals so many holes and inaccuracies, but the text resonated and echoed in its time and subsequent. To give one example, the American industrialist Henry Ford, the founder of the Ford Motor Company, adopted the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and indeed serialized it in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, which at that point in 1920 was the second most widely disseminated newspaper in America. He also produced shorter abridged versions of the protocols in book form in a series called The International Jew. The idea was adopted by anti-Semitic agitators who were very active and present in the 1930s, chiefly Father Charles Coughlin, a radio preacher who reached tens of millions of people every week, which suggests that this kind of conspiracy theory has had deep roots in American culture. Now, at that time, Jews were the central targets. As I suggested, in the present day version of this conspiracy theory, the sort of framework includes Jews as master manipulators, immigrants and people of color as those who are being deployed in order to undo the American way of life. I'll just offer one final thought before handing things over as to why we see such a significant rise in this particular form of conspiracy theory. We can go back and try and explain why in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, the anti-Semitic version of Great Replacement theory was so potent. Today, I would say, first of all, just as a general historical rule, in times of political, social, and economic instability, xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia will flourish. That's just sort of an ironclad rule of history. We have seen very considerable political and social instability in this country, certainly since 2016, and it's no surprise that we've seen very considerable rises in rates of anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim incidents from that time. The COVID pandemic is just a kind of fantastic breeding ground for conspiracy theories. Where did this come from? Who is responsible? Of course, it ignited a whole batch of anti-Asian, anti-Chinese claims. And it too is part of the backdrop to the significant rise of conspiracy theories along the lines of Great Replacement. The crisis of American democracy is obvious, and there's too much to be said about that. Maybe we'll unpack a little bit more. And then just a fourth factor that I mentioned, especially when thinking about Great Replacement, is backlash to the election of Barack Obama as president of the United States. We still haven't assessed fully, I think, the impact of that backlash against an African American as president of the United States. There's much more to be said. I think our job here is to expose both the fallacy and the peril that lurks in Great Replacement theory, and we can perhaps think together about how to do that.
Thank you so much, Professor. So now we'll turn to Kaleemah. Would love to hear from you. Now you're doing community organizing, coalition building. So before we get into the work that you do, I'd love for you if you can just take a step back and tell us a little bit about how white supremacy and the form of great replacement theory that Professor Myers has brought to us, how it manifests in many ways in white supremacy. How does that look in your community today? And how have you seen this change over the course of your life and your work?
Yeah, the way that I like to think of white supremacy is as a poison. And so the way that I've seen it is that there's this very visible aspect of the poison, this kind of state of emergency where we see, hate crimes and, people being targeted physically. And then there's almost this hidden layer of the poison that's just this like really deep sense of othering that takes place. What I've seen in the Muslim community is that this happens both ways. So of course we see mosques being targeted, we see Muslims being targeted for hate crimes, specifically Muslim women who are visibly wearing hijab. But then what we also see is children in schools being bullied, people in the workplace being discriminated against. And it can be, even the smallest drop of poison is deadly. And so the littlest microaggression, be it not creating space for representation in the workforce or, mispronouncing people's names, that has a really big impact as well. And so within the Muslim community, I think what we've seen is that it's definitely increased post 2016. I know myself, I was just a little child, when 9/11 happened. And so I kind of grew up with this knowingness that, we as a people were looked at with a certain lens of hatred and othering. But definitely post 2016, I think I've felt it even more than I've seen it. And so, I think it's something that you would hope that as time kind of goes on, that it would decrease a little. But since 2016, and that was actually the year that I started university. And so I kind of got a different sense of it in, higher education. But since 2016, I've only really seen it worsening both in terms of the, the deeper, more visible element, as well as the more hidden element. And I think there's also like a structural part to it. What I've seen in my work in organizing the Muslim community here in Sacramento is that the criminal justice system definitely plays a role in kind of promoting the assumptions that this theory rests on. These assumptions of putting people into stereotypes and demonizing them essentially. And that's one of the ways in which the Muslim community has been affected as well. Higher incarceration rates, police violence towards Muslims. We saw that even here in Sacramento. And, I think that it's definitely something that we can come together to aid, but it seems as though it's here for the long run. So
Thank you. Now, very powerful introduction. Now, taking a step back and focusing on your work, you do wonderful work at addressing hatred, targeting both the Muslim community, but also other vulnerable and targeted communities. So can you tell us a little bit about that work and perhaps strategies that you've harnessed to deal with hatred as a coalition?
Yeah. So as a community organizer, our primary goal is to develop people power to fight injustices in our communities. And so my role as a community organizer with Sacramento ACT has been primarily to develop a committee around criminal justice reform in Sacramento. And I'm now transitioning my work into developing congregation-based local organizing committees in mosques and masjids across Sacramento. And I would say that that's probably one of the primary strategies that we need to have in order to fight this, is to develop these sacred spaces where people can sit across the table from one another, having differences but not viewing each other as an other, really getting to know your neighbor in a deeper sense. And I think one of the greatest ways to do that is finding commonalities, and the commonality that we all share as minorities and as targeted peoples is that injustices are being committed against us. And so when we're coming together over, the commonality of trying to fight against injustice in our community, oftentimes that sense of belonging comes with it as well.
That's great. I love that you're talking about people physically sitting together and finding commonality. Can you maybe share an example or a story of that stands out to you as a moment of growth?
Yeah. So one of the committees that I work with, it's a local organizing committee at Masjid Sabor in Oak Park. And we meet pretty regularly. We meet typically on a monthly basis. And of course, it's a masjid. People come for Friday prayers every week. You kind of know each other. You might walk by each other with the greeting, say salams. But when we have these committee meetings, we often find that people will find commonalities even going back to like when they were children. So there was this really powerful moment where we were all sitting, sitting at the masjid, and we were doing this exercise that's part of the Belong curriculum. And this exercise is called I Am From. And so you share different stories about when you were a child or growing up, how you came to Sacramento, some of your priorities or interests being in Sacramento. And so as we were going around and sharing, we had, people who had been there in the community for decades. And they were sharing, some of their family history of migrating from the South to California. And so to be able to see those shared stories and this is primarily a Black Muslim congregation as well. And so the shared stories of leaving one place and coming to another. And this is a common thread amongst many, Black Californians as well, of migrating from the South to California, being able to see that and see that the difficulties that they've still faced being in California and being in Sacramento, that there was also commonalities in that, was a really powerful moment. And I think that it definitely led to at least the folks at our masjid feeling a lot more comfortable with each other.
Mm-hmm. Now, can you talk about maybe more about coalition work across communities, and maybe what have you seen that's successful on kind of a larger scale, and where also were there opportunities for growth in some of this work?
Well, I'll start with the area for growth. I definitely think that interfaith and multicultural spaces are the way that we need to move forward. And although Sacramento does have a strong interfaith history, I definitely think that it's something that we can live more into. And I know it's hard coming out of the pandemic, but I'm really hoping that spaces like this and conversations like this, where we have people from many different faiths coming together to just sit across the table from one another. I think that's definitely an area for growth, and I hope that a lot comes of it. And in terms of coalition building, the coalition building that I have experience of is centered around issues. And I've seen success in terms of bridging people who are directly impacted. We call them at SAC, people who are close to the pain. So they're directly impacted by criminal justice system. They're directly impacted by poverty, directly impacted by discrimination. And I see this bridging happening with people who are close to the pain and people who may not necessarily have any lived experience with the pain. And the understanding that's able to happen between people who are close to the pain, sharing their stories and giving some context to those who may be distant from it. Coalitions like that are, for example, participatory defense, which is a program that essentially it's trying to get people to come together and have a group of people who can walk people who have family members in the criminal justice system, walk them through that process. Just be an ear, be a shoulder to cry on, as well as help them, do a little bit of research for their family's case. Other coalitions, similar coalition, Court Watch, that's another platform that we started about a year back that brings people, just everyday average, Sacramento citizens who can come together and observe court proceedings to not only gain insight on what it's like to be in that position of, being in a courtroom and watching your loved one go through that process, but also to provide oversight for the courts. As we know, there's injustice that happens in our court system as well. So those issue-based coalitions, I would say I have more experience with. I know that there's other coalitions that are centered around, just building community and mutual understanding. Sac Kids First Coalition, that's a great space for if any of y'all have kids to plug them into. There's tons across Sacramento.
Thanks. It's really powerful to hear kind of how this, you're manifesting a lot of what we talked about earlier, this coalition building to try to fight this, and also room for growth. And now I'm wondering if maybe, Salam, we can bring David back into the conversation. And just, I'd love to think with you both and hear, Dave, maybe your reaction to what Kaleemah is saying about the Muslim community's current forms of experiencing bigotry, and how maybe that can be tied into some of what you were talking about earlier, how other communities like the Jewish community might be directly impacted or involved in that type of work.
Right. Well, insofar as Jews and Muslims are implicated in this particular form of conspiracy theory that we're focusing on, I think we are therefore Jews and Muslims natural allies in efforts to combat this very toxic, to use Kaleemah's word, very poisonous form of political ideology. I think we don't want to rest in this position of mutual victims of or targets of a particularly odious political ideology, but we do want to sort of use that shared experience as the foundation of a coalition to really engage in the first instance in sort of the 60s and 70s practice of consciousness raising. I think there are probably some number of millions of people who find great replacement theory very satisfying. But there are many more millions of people who know nothing about it, who know nothing of the stigmatization that is going on. And I think our first task is to raise consciousness of people by making clear what's at stake. I mean, we're talking about not just a kind of a mere assemblage of words. We're talking about a political ideology that is actionable and has resulted in mass murders. So we need to together, and not just Jews and Muslims, but other groups that are sort of implicated in this this very sweeping form of conspiracy theory. We need to really engage in that work together as partners in raising consciousness about the threat at hand, really to a vision of the United States of America. It's not just that Jews and Muslims are targeted. There's really what's at stake is really a vision of the United States of America as an open, thriving, flourishing, democratic society in which all can participate equally. And I want to just, if I may, take the opportunity to say a word about an initiative that we're launching at UCLA this year, very exciting new initiative, which is an initiative, sort of major campus initiative, multidisciplinary, to study hate. I want to tell you how it came about, because it came about in interesting and germane ways to our discussion today. Chancellor Jean Block would periodically call me up and ask me for my sense of what the temperature was on campus, especially in the wake of outbreaks of violence in Israel-Palestine. What's the campus climate like? And he was hearing from a lot of community partners that there was anti-Semitism on campus, and we wanted to understand and be responsive to it. And after a number of such calls, we would ask, what do you think we should do? And I said, well, what we do at UCLA is we study things. So maybe we should create a program or center to study anti-Semitism. But we knew at the same time that Islamophobia was very prominent in American social and political life. And so we thought maybe study anti-Semitism and Islamophobia together. But then we sort of happened on to a leap of imagination and said, how could we study anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and not study racism, deep structural racism in American society? And the leap of imagination was to suggest maybe what we need to do, maybe what our mission as a great public university is to do, is to study hate as it takes rise and is transmitted from one group to another. How is it that hate can be transmitted almost genetically from group to group, from generation to generation? And as we sort of pondered that, we also thought, but you know what, there are a lot of advances today in brain science. And maybe we should see if it's possible to understand how hate takes rise in individuals as well. And that set of reflections led us to this idea to really try and get underneath the phenomenon that is so persistent and so toxic in American society and many societies around the world. And so we are starting in these days an initiative to study hate. We have 23 research teams on campus, ranging from cognitive scientists to anthropologists, sociologists, and historians. And the ultimate promise is not to add up the work of those 23 siloed research teams, but to imagine what together we come to understand about hate. And so I want to invite all of you to stay connected to our work. We're about to publicly announce the commencement of this program in early October, but I want to give you a preview of what's coming down the pike. And I think it's obviously very germane to initiatives that are underway in the California State Legislature and an issue of great importance for all of us. We're not seeking to erase the particularities of Islamophobia or anti-Semitism or anti-Black or anti-Asian racism, but we are trying to understand what are some of the commonalities that occur again and again, and how can we use the resources of great researchers to understand the phenomenon better. So I did want to just put that out there as one thing that I think we can do.
Yeah, I hope it's useful for state government as well as federal government. I attended the White House United We Stand Summit last week. And there were 150 civic organizations represented. We were one of them. There was also the ADL, the National Urban League, National Action Center of Al Sharpton, LULAC, a Latino organization, and many others. And amazing stories of victims of hate that transformed their pain to purpose. And I think we need to show those stories. And as we're studying hate, I think we couple that with these stories that be a powerful way of providing a counter narrative to the conspiracy theory. But I wanted to also ask, there was a key word that, what's his name? Renaud Camus mentioned when you were reading from his book, is that we, Muslims, immigrants, what have you, Jews for that matter, do not want to assimilate. And I've learned that is a very charged word, because that can be seen as we don't want to be part of society. We want to form ghettos. And in terms of Muslims, they accuse us, they call it stealth jihad, that we want to overtake the country and bring Sharia, and 22 states have anti-Sharia legislation, as if there is such a thing, of a Sharia that is coming to take over the US Constitution. It just shows they don't know anything what they're talking about. They know nothing about what they're saying. So, but in any case, the word comes back to, we are not assimilating. But in anti-racist culture, and and Kaleemah, please inform us on this, sometimes that's used, the word assimilation is a form of racism, as if we have to change our identity to be accepted by the majority. And that in and of itself is a form of racism. So this is very tricky, because if you don't have confidence in governmental institutions, that is the beginning of the end of democracy. And so we lose government, we lose confidence in these forums, for example, like they think it's a waste of time. And then on the other hand, they point to us, they see, I told you, they don't want to be a part of our society. So how do we navigate that? And I'll start with, if we can start with Kaleemah and then David.
Yeah, I always question that, right? Like, assimilate to what and assimilate to who? I think we as people of color, as minorities, navigate it by just being true to ourselves and very unapologetic, form a very intentional sense of belonging in the cities and the counties and the states that we reside in, and take ownership of bridging across cultures and bridging across communities. But then I would also kind of flip that on its head and say, well, then why can't those who kind of put out this call for us to assimilate, I think there's an element there of them needing to assimilate to a diverse, multicultural, multi-faith society that has and will continue to develop.
So you're saying that we still want to be a part of society without changing our identity. What needs to change is this orientation to having a white majority society to a multicultural, or what's called pluralism. We have to meet the ideals of what our constitution calls for, which is all men and women are created equal, and to be in a society that is pluralistic.
Yeah, so this is a central theme in Jewish history writ large. I would say Jewish history in its grand sweep offers up a really instructive response to the question about assimilation, which I would say really should be understood in two ways. There's assimilation that leads to the loss of identity, assimilation that sort of extends beyond the capacity to preserve features of one's own distinctive group. That's one way to understand assimilation. And that's a form of assimilation that many Jews and Muslims consider negative, and not a positive form of assimilation, because it entails the loss of all connection to one's ethnic, cultural, or religious group. There's another way to understand assimilation as a necessary, quotidian, daily form of engagement with the society of which you are a part. That is necessary for society and for you as well. In other words, you can't engage, you can't survive in a state of total disengagement. You can't survive economically if you live in an isolated cave. So you engage economically and by extension socially, and then in order to advance the interests of your own family or group, you engage in the political process, which is part of the game of interest group politics in America. And that's another form of assimilation. Some sociologists refer to it as acculturation. And that's about really finding the balance between robust commitment to the common weal and preserving a connection to one's own, again, ethnic, racial, religious group, which offers up cultural texture. And I would say that, we might say that's just sort of a wishy-washy intermediate position. I think that engagement back and forth between sort of a core cultural identity and participation in wider society builds a certain cultural muscle. Right? I think it's an exercise that's animating, it's vitalizing. It's preferable to sitting in a cave and having no engagement. And I would say it's preferable to sort of full engagement to the loss of any distinctive form of identity. That is what we're all engaged in various forms. And I think Jews and Muslims know that process very well. Now, it's interesting that great replacement theory sort of makes a contradictory claim, right? It says Muslims are unassimilable and Muslims are in stealthful fashion seeking to assimilate into our society, take it over. Right? That kind of inconsistency is a hallmark of conspiracy theorizing, and one should never judge conspiracy theory by its theoretical consistency. It's really often animated by these deep contradictions, and that's why.
We see that in Judaism too, right?
So
We see that in Jewish conspiracy theories too, right?
The takeover.
Jews are
They don't want to be part of
exactly.
society.
Jews are Marxist revolutionaries intent on global domination,
Right.
to introduce a regime of communism. Jews are arch capitalists intent on global domination through the monopolizing of capital.
I'm just struck hearing you make this point about Muslim conspiracy theories and seeing how similar it is,
Very
right?
similar.
Yeah, and that, I should say, that's part of the success of such conspiracy theories. I would always say that's part of the success of anti-Semitism. It's staggering malleability, right? The ability to assume different forms, in fact, completely opposing forms, and sort of get away with it. Like, how could that be? You could say arch-capitalist, arch-Marxist, communist intent on world domination, but we often hear exactly those things from the same mouth.
Another question about this threat. So I believe the FBI and the CIA, all these intelligence agencies have declared that white supremacist violence now is a greater threat than even Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And when Al-Qaeda and ISIS were the national security threat for quite some time after 9/11, there was this talk about, well, we need a counter narrative to what they're saying. We need a counter narrative that America is at war with Islam. And so the United States government went through so many exercises of demonstrating that Muslims are part of America, America is not at war with Islam, and so on and so forth. What's the counter narrative to what white supremacists are saying today, that they're being replaced? if you were,
Well,
you
I
have the
do want
ear
to
of-
say one thing.
Yeah.
Um,
or do we need a
to
counter?
situate, yeah, we need another counter narrative is exactly what you referred to. It's a doctrine of cultural pluralism. America's stronger when it is an amalgam of so many different vibrant cultural, ethnic, religious threads.
Yeah.
The mosaic is more, not just more colorful, it's stronger. I think that's absolutely the argument. I was going to say something else, but
Well, and since you said that,
Yeah.
it's a cue for us to say that we're preparing a policy paper on the counter narrative to the great replacement, and we're calling it the great enrichment.
Oh, great.
That we are in, and it's a fact that we have all enriched America, financially, socially, culturally, food, in so many ways. America has been enriched by the presence of this great multicultural society that Kaleemah talked about. Question for you, Kaleemah. What does it take for communities that you deal with to restore or to have any confidence in our government? Because I feel like that's part of the crisis, is that many communities of color have no confidence in their police, in their state government, in their federal government. So what will it take?
Yeah, I think it's on the part of the government and on the part of the police and on the part of representatives to demonstrate a very intentional care for these communities, to acknowledge the harm that has been caused, to acknowledge the history, to offer up solutions. I think one of the biggest things that I hear in my work is fund resources that will actually help the community. So fund, youth programs, fund rehabilitation services, fund tiny homes for the homelessness. And so I think that kind of seeing the, we have the saying, like, put your money where your mouth is, type of thing. I think seeing that, government representatives, police, what have you, are willing to actually put resources and put funding into the needs of the community. In our organizing model, the first thing that we do is we go out and we do listening. And the reason why we do listening is to figure out what the self-interest is of the community that we're trying to organize. Once you find what that need or what that interest is, we then strategize to try and figure out solutions, alongside the communities. And I think that's part of what needs to happen is an acknowledgement of what the real needs are, acknowledgement of the historic disinvestment that has taken place in communities of color, and then a commitment to help them prosper.
I remember what I
Yeah, yeah.
wanted to say, and
Go
it
ahead.
builds on what was just said, which is sort of, I think, an additive point. We need to think locally. We need to begin at the local level. But we also need to understand the phenomenon we're talking about is a global phenomenon. It's not an American phenomenon. Part of the reason why is, I think, in my own idiosyncratic way of thinking, the way in which globalization has played out. Globalization as a very powerful economic and social force, which is to say this idea of sort of erasing boundaries of nation states, of language, of cultural difference, really as, in the first instance, a project of capitalism. And in retrospect, rather predictably, many parts of the world reacted against globalization and the fear of sort of the erasure of borders and cultural distinctiveness with a kind of ethno-nationalist pushback. Where do we see it? Well, where don't we see it? We see it in Turkey, we see it in Hungary, we see it in Poland, we see it in France, we see it in the UK, we see it in Russia, we see it in the United States. I think we need to think our way out of this conundrum, because we're not going to forestall, we're not going to prevent globalization from continuing, and sort of we can't put that genie back in the bottle. But we do need to think of ways in which we can assure people that they're not going to be displaced in sort of a grand global economic order. wrought by globalization. We do need to assure people that, that their sense of cultural distinctiveness is not going to be altogether eradicated. And at the same time, we need to, especially in this country, and I feel this with sort of a new conviction that borders on the hyper naive. We do at the same time need to speak more about the common good. I've become like a late stage convert to redoubled efforts at basic civics education, educating the values of democracy, advancing the idea of the common weal without the erasure of cultural distinctiveness. That's that exercise that I think we need to engage in. We should understand that at the local level, at the level of local activism and interfaith and interethnic work, but we should also understand it as part of a larger global phenomenon that the world is passing through.
Thank you.
You mentioned the common good. I just wanted just a short story, and I'll give it back to you, David. You can start wrapping up. So I just had surgery on my elbow, and this is why I'm wearing this because my hand is paralyzed right now because of nerve damage. But in any case, so I go around, I'm traveling, and wherever I've traveled, every time somebody comes up to me and says, "Can I help you?" And yes, there is racism and bigotry, but there's really a lot of good in America. There are so many. I believe that there are more good people than there are bad people. And we have to believe in that. We have to believe in the human spirit. We have to believe in this America that Kaleemah is talking about, that is bringing all these people together, e pluribus unum, from many we are one. That there is a common understanding, even and especially with our differences, that our differences are here to enrich our society, not to compete. So, these micro goods, as opposed to microaggressions that I see is to me is a sign of hope, that we can get through this, and that the 21st century is the century of a pluralistic democracy for our country. So
I love that closing of hope. I'm thinking also about some of the work that's been done in this building. We're physically, for folks online, we are physically sitting in the California State Capitol in Sacramento. We've got community members and staff members from the building here with us. And I've seen how the work that we've done has been able to, we've passed some really serious legislation this year and in recent years that shows a really committed dedication to working across boundaries, to understanding one another, to addressing globalization too. We are one state, but people always use the phrase, as goes California, so goes the nation and the world. By way of example, California just passed a major law that would help hold social media companies accountable to the spread of hate online. We have our social media companies that have created, helped exacerbate globalization based in California. And our laws here, we have a population here that can allow our laws to make a broader than California impact, a national or global impact. So I'm seeing the work that's being done in the advocacy space, in the legislative space, to try to work together to create a common good. And it's done through coalition. It's really done through coalition. We have an amazingly diverse legislature and an amazingly diverse Capitol community. And this is the start. There's more work to be done. But I just want to first thank everyone for being here. I really want to thank particularly our panelists for bringing your expertise, Professor Myers and Kaleemah. It's amazing. This is just the beginning, and we'll continue this conversation as we move forward.
Thank you.
And then we'll pass it back over to Max to say any final closing words.
Thank you. I just want to thank everyone again for gathering here with us today. It was a great pleasure of the Jewish Caucus to be able to bring these amazing panelists together, as well as these hosts. You all have done a fantastic job, and we deeply appreciate it. We don't want to keep anyone here any longer, but thank you also to the audience for coming. And if there, especially to staff, if these are issues that you're curious about, if you want to connect more on any of these, please reach out, and we can either help connect with resources, we can help connect with the panelists, these organizations. There's a lot of amazing work being done, and we want to work with you all to bring it even further. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.